We got all the usual
Oh,
suspects
okay.
rounded up.
Well, good.
All the usual suspects.
Okay. So I hope everybody's got their thinking caps with them today, because this one's
I don't know about that.
got a lot to it.
I left it at home.
There's some decided fun to come, especially toward the end in here. But continuing, I think, probably do one more session after this. Won't be next week because there's the church program, but then we'll do one more after that, and then probably take a break. And what I was thinking about doing when we get back together, probably after Easter, was thinking about angels and demons and the devil. If that fires people up, maybe everybody talks about it, but what's actually in Scripture, what's actually out there, what's actually meant. So that's kind of what I was thinking about, rather than just continuing down the history path for a while. So give that some thought, and we can kick that around next week and see if that's where you want to go. The idea that I have for today is way overloaded with a lot of different things, and the idea that I was going to try was just to race through the first half. But as usual, I want to make sure you are comfortable, especially with a small group like this, that you ask any questions that come as we go, because there's a ton of stuff in here. A lot of it I didn't know anything about, when we started. There's terms of art, and there's issues that go back all the way to the 5th century, and that's kind of where I want to start you out. But basically what we're beginning with is this idea that has permeated the discussion, and I'll give you my reasoning why I think it's there, for a long time, that says science and theology, science and religion, science and faith have been at odds. They've been fighting each other. The idea that the science world would bring up is that the church has held science back. The church has been against science. And the idea that the church would say in that context is, you guys are a bunch of heretics that are just trying to undermine our faith. Well, in the context of what's historically true, there's quite a bit that's at odds with that thinking. And as the author, as I'll show you in a second, of this great courses that I'm going to pull a lot of information from today, Lawrence Principe out of Johns Hopkins, says no one in the science academic community buys that. No one sees it that way. But there's a fair amount of permutations, and it shifts, from time to time. So what are the ideas that are involved? And I decided that there was no way that I was going to be able to cram 6 lectures, which is basically what the course is putting in place for us today, that I wanted to touch on. There's no way I can really do justice to that in that time, but maybe if we did touch and goes with some of the superstars along the way, some of the big names, and see what they had to say and see how that connects up, maybe we can get some insight into how it goes. So I picked probably the most famous ones that we would find anywhere in American early history, religious history. Jonathan Edwards is about as staunch a guy that kind of has one foot in both worlds, the pre-revivalist, the institutionalist. He's a very learned scholar, but he's also a guy who's very, very much interested in the Enlightenment and in the study of nature. And I told you the sad story about how he died. He put his life on the line, and it cost him. When he wound up trying to get himself inoculated for smallpox. And in those days, the way they did it was with live bacillus, not with dead ones. So it took him over and he died from it. You know, he was on his way to being the president of Princeton. He'd just been appointed president. What about Isaac Newton, probably the most famous scientist of the ancient times before we really get cranked over in the U.S. This is taking us back to England, and Isaac Newton is one of the early founders and early legendary guys in the Royal Society, which is the oldest continuously operating scientific outfit there is to be found. What does he have to say about all this? Where does he stand? Well, it turns out Isaac Newton spends more time on theology than he does on science. We'd never guessed that. Guess what his favorite book of the Bible was? This will gas you. Take a guess.
Genesis.
That's a good answer. He spent an awful lot of time there.
The apple.
But you're not quite right. Got to go the other end. Revelation. He was because he had that mathematical kind of an orientation. He wanted to get it all figured out and all mapped out. So before there was any of this traffic that we see today in terms of predicting the future and, you know, counting the numbers of the horns on the beast and, you know, all of the different presumed prophecies, Isaac Newton was deep into that stuff. He was really interested in it. But my favorite, and I didn't know this when I started, is the guy that my childhood pastor talked about, I think, every other Sunday. He was always talking about St. Augustine. And from what I understand, it's okay to say Augustine or Augustine, either one. And it turns out, unbeknownst to me, that Augustine really sets the stage for the modern way that we think about science and the modern way that science and religion should be conceived together. He basically writes the rule book for the next 2,000 years. And you didn't see that coming. Now, Augustine is about as prolific a writer as you're ever going to find in your life. You could spend your whole life reading Augustine and you might not get it done. He's got millions of words in print. He's got a couple hundred sermons that we have that are recorded in print, not recorded on tape, but that we can access, so we know what he was thinking. And his Confessions, where he talks about his life, that's his first famous introduction, you know, to the world of literature, is a classic. It was the first time that anyone famous had written such a tome. It's long, and he talks about his journey and what he's thinking about, and that would have been enough to make him famous just by itself, just the Confessions. But then he writes The City of God, and we've talked about him in here from time to time about the theology that he brings to the fore, especially in the context of one of the areas that he fights really hard, which is something that he actually invents. You know, it might make you cringe a little bit, but Augustine is the one that we credit. Luther, even the Mormons, and the Catholics especially, everybody wants to claim Augustine. He's the one that invents the idea of original sin.
What was his miracle to be sanctified?
Pardon?
What was the miracle he performed to be sanctified?
That's a good question. I don't know. He was awfully famous, and he was the first bishop of Northern Africa. He's in the 5th century, just about the time that the church is getting started. So he might have gotten beatified just by virtue of his service to the church, just because he was so important in terms of how the church got its sea legs. This is a guy who supplies the theology for Catholicism and Protestantism. That really makes him unique among all the writers you're likely to find. Everybody claims him, but later on, 1,000 years later, when the church creates holy orders, the Catholic Church creates holy orders, one of the orders is named after him and takes his the Augustinians. And guess who's an Augustinian monk? It's important to us. Luther. Luther's an Augustinian monk studying, what Augustine. So what does he have to say about all of this controversy? Then I want to make sure before we leave that I touch base with you again about some of the terms, because they're going to keep coming up again, and these are not terms that naturally necessarily flow off the lips in day-to-day conversation. So it's worthwhile to keep things like hermeneutics and exegesis in front of us. Pastor Jay will talk your arm off on it. He loves that stuff, and he's good at it, and you can get him to explain a lot of, but the average guy, if you walked up on the street and says, let's talk about exegesis for a while, he said, no, that Jesus was executed a long time ago. I don't think I want to talk about that right now. I also want to reprise and go back to remember, I think he's probably the most important scientist of our day, of our time. Now, he's retired, but I think there's probably no one more important in the context of the scientific community than Francis Collins, because of the work that he did in really two venues. They're both under the same umbrella rubric. They're both under the National Institutes of Health. But the stuff that he did where he basically headed up, there was a parallel effort, both private and public. And he headed up the public arm that studied the human genome. And he's unique in that he's an academic, he's a folk singer who's raised with kind of almost a hippie culture by parents, in the artsy-fartsy world. And he's a guy who's very scholarly in terms of theology, who came to belief in God very late in life. And he puts the two together in unique ways. But what's fascinating to me is he's also an MD. And that's what really drove him in all of this, because as he studied on his way, he said, if we can get a hold of the building blocks of life, he calls it God's language. If we can understand God's language, we can help people. There are diseases that happen to us, and we all know about it. We were kind of kidding each other before we got started today that, the things that happen to us as we age that we'd rather not go through. We'd rather not deal with it. Some of these are genetic. Some of these are things that are done, by ourselves to ourselves. And if we understood the mechanisms, how that worked better, we could probably have a better quality of life. And that, as an MD, is something that's really where this guy lives. So on the one hand, he's a very gifted speaker. He's a strong academic. He doesn't take any lip from anybody that says, I got the answers and can't prove it. He says, where's your evidence? Let's do this scientifically. And he heads up the biggest core of scientists for a major project, probably since the atom bomb. This is an important guy. And what he did in that video that we looked at, that I really liked, is he said, let's look at the history of science and let's look at how these pieces fit together, and they'll take you as far as what he called Einstein's God. They'll take you as far as the deists will go. But now how do you get from that point that says there is a God, and that's really what all the talk is about, until you reach that cliff. Now you're at that cliff, and he says, how do you make the translation from there is a God and there's a cliff to Jesus? And he has a way of doing that. And it ties you back in a way to Augustine, because he says, if there is a God that cares about, that has a personality that cares about the people, cares about us, cares about things, cares about his creation, then I'm not up to that standard. I don't make the grade. But there's a way for me to get there. And I thought, wow, what a connection to make. As a scientist, this is a rational connection. Now, there's 101 probably different ways that any one of us can come to faith, but that's not a way I would have seen coming. That's not something I would have seen a typical scientist say. But he's doing it rationally. And, you know, I have some quibbles with some of the things that he would take from the standpoint of the way that we see the world as Lutherans. He's got a couple of differences because he's planted himself pretty firmly in the evangelical world. And that's okay. You know, they're Christians and they're believers and they're strong in what they do, and they're probably better witnesses than the typical Lutheran is. You know, one of our bishops had a quote that made me want to take him out and draw and quarter him. he said, evangelism is not in Lutheran DNA. And I thought, oh, come on, really? Do you have to say that even if it's true? You know, I'm not sure that it is, but if, you know, why would you make that kind of statement to other Lutherans? If you're the bishop, you should be cheerleading. You know, you should be stirring people up. You shouldn't be, you know. So anyway, so I want to touch base before we lose them. And one of the things that Principe does that I didn't see coming is he ties this idea of higher criticism that I've mentioned with you 3 or 4 times now to the controversy in science over the age of the earth. This is all coming together at the same time as evolution. So why are we in this room, in this generation of us, why are we experiencing the idea today of a presumed struggle or a presumed conflict? I think it all boils down to the elephant in the phone booth, which is Darwin. I think you take Darwin out of the equation in America, and you don't have that same story in the same way at all. The idea of natural selection, meaning I'm kind of equating that with Darwin at this point, because Darwin as a whole is not controversial. The idea of evolution is not controversial, including American preachers. You know, by and large, they'd integrated the idea, but what they did is they twisted it. And they said, evolution may be the picture that you use to describe how things went down the path, but it went down according to God's plan. It went down according to a design. And Darwin didn't say that. Darwin said it went according to
random.
Nature.
Yeah, random, pure luck, just the way it happened. And once something got into the gene pool and it gave an advantage, that's what stuck, because it had a competitive advantage for breeding purposes. Now, what Francis Collins did is he was able to show how you can see even human complexities. Such things, the one that really sticks in the craw of those who are looking for a design answer says, there's no way that the eye could have come about from evolution. It's too complex, too many different pieces, too many things have to, the probability is so infinitesimally small, I think that wrecks your argument. What Francis Collins found out in the process of doing the DNA analysis is it's kind of like if you go back 20 years or so and you had these come to play instead of having to type in the key connections. You now have little batches of code that perform the same function, and you can cut and paste those little batches of code together. That's the way the eye came about, he said. That's the way that growth went up, because different organisms had little batches of code, not just one piece of a gene on a chromosome, but collections of little pieces that they can show how they've aggregated and have worked together. And that comes because they have mapped out the genome of a whole variety of animals. And they can see, including some very small animals, some microscopic animals, as well as humans. And they can see some similarities and so forth. So being able to do all of that has taken us to a new playing field. It's a new kind of level. Well, if you are in America, we've gone exactly the opposite way of the way things were going in medieval times. In medieval times, the highest level that you could aspire to would be to be a cleric, would be to be someone who was a preacher, someone who was in charge of a church, because you had to understand philosophy and you had to understand they didn't have a word for science. You know, you would have to understand and make sense out of all of these things. But in America, what we had as we moved west is we said, we don't want your academic learning. Remember the Great Awakening? And George Whitefield comes out and he says, the reason that your churches are vacant is because you have dead preachers preaching to them. He says, they're not exciting, they haven't kept up, they don't stir it up. But I can read the Bible and I can tell you what it means and I can get you going. So you ought to pay attention to me and you ought to come to my service. And by the way, let's keep this ministry green. And so what you have in America is you have a plethora of little splinter churches all over the place. And you got guys on the frontier saying, I'm the church of what's happening now, I've got a key to it and I can read the Bible as well as the next guy. So come on down, stick with me. And we get a lot of this. So it's just the opposite. On the one hand, if you wanted to be in the guild of being a pastor, as it were, in ancient England, it would take you 10 years of study in order to be qualified, be considered a professional pastor, as it were. On the frontier, it might be 10 minutes. If you can talk someone into following you, that's okay. And that's part of our history and that's part of our problem. We have still that going on. I also want to finish today, if I can, with a guy I was telling Joe about, who's a Californian, went to school at Biola, did his PhD and master's in the Bible, in the words of the Bible, and runs the most interesting ministry. He's just retired again as well. I think this guy is a giant of a man, and I think what he's done and what his organization that he started is really fascinating. So I want you to get a hold of Dan Wallace. If I don't get there today, go on YouTube and look at any of his videos, and I'll try and get it before we're done, because first of all, he's fun to listen to, but he's got about probably a half a dozen different versions of what I want to show you today. I've got, I think, the shortest one that does any justice to it. It says, is the text that we have today, is the Bible's words that we have today, is that what they had back then? Well, we know for one thing that the Bible that was the version that Jesus and St. Paul had is not as good a translation as what we've got today. Because what we've got is older. And it's a product of a great deal more study and a great deal more development. But at the day, the Septuagint, which was the first Bible that Calvin worked from in Geneva, is still the one that the Eastern Orthodox people use. So it's still very much alive, and it's still very interesting stuff to be out there. So it turns out that the handout has grown wings and gone away that I was going to give you, so I'll have to do it next time. But I wanted to give you Augustine's 4 ways of thinking about text, interpretation. So I'll come back to that in a second, but I did not know about those. Okay, that's exegesis. Let's start with that one, because I'll come back to these terms again. What's the difference between hermeneutics and exegesis? Hermeneutics is the lens, if you will. It's how you're looking at it to start with. It's what are you bringing to the party? What's your big picture view? How are you trying to fit these words together? You know, no matter which way you're going to go, you're going to bring some sort of a picture by which you frame what you're reading. Exegesis is, what do these words say? What do these individual words mean? Dan Wallace is an expert exegete. Jay is a very good exegete. He likes to dig into the words. You notice in his sermons, he'll spend some time on that and say, where does this come from? That's exegesis. They have to take courses in that. Every pastor in the Lutheran world has to take at least one course in exegesis. You got to get good, you know, at doing that sort of stuff. In order to do that, you have to be able to know the original language. So if we're going to professionalize our ministers, we're going to say, you're going to have to take a course in probably 2 courses. One course in
Aramaic, Hebrew,
and one course. We don't do Aramaic because we don't have that language by and large.
Greek?
Greek. Hebrew and Greek. Aramaic is a derivation sort of Hebrew. It's not quite pidgin, but it's an offshoot. You can get an Aramaic Bible, interestingly enough. One of my friends from prior church had one, and it's a little different. The wording will be a little different. Well, so the question is, are they in conflict? I'm going to say, let's take a look. Which ones of these make the most sense to you? Which depiction?
Gears.
Yeah, the cogwheels.
Someone likes gears. Fine.
They mesh.
All right.
the puzzle also meshes.
Yeah. But notice there's a
But they're
difference.
separate. They're
The
kept
gears are
separate.
saying science and religion, and the puzzle is saying science and, what's the difference?
Oh, yeah.
Is the faith more personal?
Yeah.
Say again?
I would say faith is probably a personal
Okay.
manifestation, might not be an outward expression of your
Yeah.
religion.
That's good. What we will find is for most of the discussion to look at these two territories, the way it's broken down, it's not by any means exhaustive, but the easiest way to break it down for people to kind of get on the same page, to talk with each other, is reason on the one hand and faith on the other hand. Are they mutually exclusive? No way. But they are different ways, as a general way of thinking about it, of approaching how do we know what we know? How do we understand? How do we make sense of the earth? How do we pull these things together? Lawrence Praseep says, no way should we think about these things as a product of the warfare thesis. Okay, where does it come from then? If he's right, and he presents a very good case in this course that says, let's look at what scientists were really saying and how religious people were reacting to that, and what were the religious people doing before they were called scientists? What were they experimenting with, and how did they view things? Where then did we get this idea that there's this eternal conflict and ne'er the twain shall meet, and it's always going to be butting heads, and we can't have the one talking with the other without some sort of bashing going on? Well, he says there are two books, and this really bothered me the first time I heard it. And I don't want to spend a ton of time on it, but I will show it to you. John William Draper was the first president of the American Chemical Society. He's a star. He's a superstar scientist, and he's an anti-Catholic racist. And basically, he's asked to bash Catholics. And he does so very successfully in this process. Andrew Dixon White was the first president, and this really kills me because I used to recruit there, and I still like the place. Cornell University. Cornell University is a famous American higher education institution. I love the students there that I used to recruit. They're smart as a whip. It's a great place to recruit. It's a fun place, but the reality is, he got into trouble, did White, because he wouldn't make it a religious institution. He did it outside the church, and they beat on him for it. They criticized him for it. So he said, I'll get your. Draper is the one who probably had the biggest calling, and these are the end of the 19th century. And these guys, you can find their books still on Amazon today. The Vatican Council, the First Vatican Council, and I'll show you some of these at some point, I hope, is the first modern council where the Pope called cardinals together and said, there's controversy out here. Again, let's see if we can't get this straightened out. Let's see if we can't get reason and faith in sync here, and let's remind ourselves of who we are as a church. Draper didn't like that, so he beat on him. And this went under the guise of science. He said Protestantism, on the other hand, encourages science. So Protestantism is good, Catholicism is bad, you don't buy my book. White writes a history of the warfare of science, and that language seems to give a little more credibility. He's probably a better writer, but he was not, he didn't have as much of a reach as Draper did. But these two guys by themselves, I found it over and over and over again as I was researching this, are ones that all scientists seem to know about. And they keep pointing to that. So it's a 19th century creation that we've inherited, that we've kind of lived with, that lingers on and dies a slow death and is still to be found. Here's White. And unfortunately, recognize this guy?
Oh.
He's Cornell's most famous alum. I never watched the show, but the people when I was working at JPL kind of liked having him around because he was free publicity. You know, he made astronomy popular again. Remember the show that I'm talking about?
Billions and billions and billions and
That's the boy.
billions.
That's the one. You know. Now, having said that, I'll lay a little quick trip on you because it really caught me off guard. I told you from time to time that I do a Bible study on Saturdays with Missouri Senators over in Riverside. And the pastor there is probably the most unique pastor I've ever encountered because he started life in the Greek Orthodox world as a priest. Then he left that and became a Roman Catholic priest. Thence he migrated, having read Luther, to the Missouri Synod. But that gives him an ability to translate and an ability to see things that the average theoretician, that the average theologian isn't going to see. Now, think back, this is not going to be hard for you. John 3:16. Everybody knows the quote. You can see it at any ball game, right? We mistranslate it. For God so loved
The world.
Not really. Better translation is, for God so loved the cosmos. Think about that for a second. Did God create the stars and the heavens and everything around, or did he just create us and the earth? What does he love? He loves his creation. He doesn't just love us. What does Genesis say about creation?
The heavens and the
It
earth.
was
Heavens and earth.
It was good. It was what he wanted to do. So I've got a bunch of quotes here that I don't want to take the time to show you, but NPR breathlessly interviewed Sagan's wife about 10 years after he died. And they're making him out kind of to be a saint. And the reality, I think the easiest way to think of him is probably to say he's one of the seekers. He's of that generation. He's not quite a Shirley MacLaine seeker type, but you know, he's in that same kind of vein. But look at some of these things that he has to say. Was he religious? Here's a faith statement for you. God was so important that it has to be true. Is that going to is that going to persuade you? My favorite quote of all of this: God is too small. Wouldn't it be good if God was big enough to handle nature? Now, the reason that I kept this part in is I wanted to make a point of tying this to where we're going to come from, or where we're going to come to, and that is intelligent design, in quotes. Intelligent design is just another name for anti-evolution. And intelligent design is still very much a part of the discussion that we find ourselves in. So in the last session that I want to do one of these days, in this particular sequence of discussions, is I want to look at how did evolution morph in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s to where we find ourselves right now. But before we get there, I want to fast forward to the end of this. I'm going to have to miss Augustine for today, but we'll pick him back up. Because I don't want you not to get a look at this guy. Dan Wallace grows up in California. He looks pretty scraggly now. His beard is all kind of bedraggled. He's not as sharp as he used to be, which is why he retired. But the work that he's done is the most interesting work, I think, to be found in the academic community, in the theological and biblical world, because what he's done is he's created an organization that goes around the world and finds all these little bits of paper and all of these codices and all of these papyri that are still haven't completely disintegrated, and he's using the best digital photography that's available to capture them and hold on to them. A lot of them have been put on microfilm, but that's not very good. So what he's doing is he's trying to preserve it and then putting it on the web so that we can all see it. So he is the textual critic. He's the exegete. He's the guy who does the exegesis for an online Bible called the Net Bible, Bible.net. It's free. You can look at it. And the thing that makes it different from every other Bible source that you can get online that is really cool is, if you look at it, looks like that, and you can bring up a panel on the right, and it will show you for every verse that you want to highlight what the various fragments that deal with this particular verse said. And it'll give you the theory behind why did it get translated this way. So if you want to do some digging, and it's free, and he's put this all out for everybody to see. So what he's doing is he's debating in public and giving talks on the subject that says, is the Bible that we have today trustworthy? Can we believe that we've got the real thing? And there are people that are making money saying, no, you cannot. Why not? Because they're gone. They're disintegrated.
They're gone.
Oh, they're gone, thank you.
You know, we don't have anything that is original. We never did have an original. But Dan Wallace says, yes, we do, and yes, we can. He says, it's choice A, B, or C, but not D. What is choice D? None of the above. It's either this version, or this version, because we've gotten good enough. Now, how is that possible? That's what I want to show you. I want to give you about 20 minutes of Dan Wallace, where he's going to explain, yeah, you can make a criticism if you want to of the fact that we don't have the originals, the original, but what we've got is so good, and we've got so much of it, that our problem is not that we don't have enough to work with. Problem is we got too much. You know, we got stuff that'll keep people occupied, good job security for the rest of their careers, because there's just a ton of it. And in the meantime, what he's doing is he's making it available for free. Here's some of the resources that he's got that we can look at. csntm.org, Center for the Study of New Testament Manuscripts. I love this. Look at this. Greek New Testament, display any verse of the Greek New Testament along with its variants. The Net Bible I was telling you about. Compare manuscripts side by side. Look at the pictures of them. You can see them. You want to see Dead Sea Scrolls and stuff like that? You can go here and you look at it. All right. Let me see if I can bring you up, Dan. Now, I want to preface this a little bit because he's now out of Texas, even though he's retired. And my Texan friends are all a little different from Californians. They talk a little different. So they're a little fun to listen to. And I think that's a good way for us to finish today. So we'll take a look at the other types of criticism, hopefully in 2 weeks. See y'all.
Thank you.
Thank you.